I'll dispense with the debate on whether absolute monarchs are the same as dictators, or the dictators have to be necessarily tyrants, or whether there's even a difference between a tyrant and a dictator other than the one I kind of delineated in the Roman era. Looking more broadly at kind of an ocean of dictators, we do see some patterns and similarities among them. They certainly are remorseless and have this kind of narcissistic faith in the historical necessity and the providence of their existence, a belief that any means will inevitably justify the ends and that they will be forgiven. These are characteristics found in sociopaths and psychopaths. Um, they certainly are the characteristics of a narcissist, although, to call Hitler or Stalin or Mao Zedong a narcissist is like handing out speeding tickets at the Indy 500, if I may paraphrase Apocalypse Now. What often will characterize these surely psychopaths is the extraordinary number of people that they put to death. High national mortality is a characteristic of a dictatorship. And these deaths often can serve various purposes. Dictators will, of course, use mass death for the specific purpose of terror, as Caligula, the Roman tyrant, would remark, "I don't care if they respect me so long as they fear me." Sometimes the killing is just a practical solution to an obstacle on the road to power. As Stalin pointed out, death is the solution to all problems. No man, no problem. Idi Amin would often remind his opponents, you cannot run faster than a bullet. Sometimes there is some kind of missionary purpose, a distribution of wealth or land or class power. Pol Pot, of course, believed, as many of his predecessors did, better to kill an innocent by mistake than spare an enemy by mistake. Stalin, of course, famously remarked, one death is a tragedy, 1 million is a statistic. And indeed, in his goal of establishing the Soviet Union as a great industrial power, he sacrificed millions of people to a lethal slavery. Sometimes it's just a byproduct of revolution. As Nikolai Yezhov said, when you chop wood, chips fly. And this quote from Nikolai Yezhov, who himself was not a dictator, actually brings us to another theme in dictatorships. The one that Emily Bronte, interestingly enough, illustrates, where she says, the tyrant grinds down his slaves and they don't turn against him, they crush those beneath him. We're talking about the dictator's alter ego, their henchmen and their executioners, the instruments of oppression and dictatorial power without which dictators would be unable to do anything. And in some ways, the henchmen and enablers fascinate me more than their masters. Um, Dictators are often extraordinary personalities with bigger than life psychopathologies, but their enablers and their servants are often the most ordinary people, and it's their ordinariness that so much fascinates me. Hitler had Heinrich Himmler, and Himmler had Reinhard Heydrich, and beneath them was a vast cult of a bureaucracy, the notorious SS and Gestapo, and the Kripo, the Kriminalpolizei, and the ZIPO, the Sicherheitspolizei, the security police, a complex bureaucracy of death that mostly was responsible for those 7 million murders, many of which were, I should say, committed one by one perpetrator killing one victim, not the kind of mass killings by firing squads or, by the gas chambers, which had very limited and specific use in Nazi Germany. These instruments of oppression essentially functioned like serial killers, killing a few victims a day, coming home from their job, washing up, killing, playing with their kids. Their wife would bring them. They did travel often with their wives and girlfriends. Their wife or girlfriend would bring them their supper. Again, as I say, wash out the blood from their shirt, and then the next day they would go out and kill some more after this kind of overnight cooling off period. And again, this, I think, type of killing is what makes Nazi Germany and Hitler's dictatorship so notorious in our cultural perception and our historical perception. Lenin's dictatorship of the proletariat was served by Felix Dzerzhinsky, Iron Felix, the individual you see on the right with the long gray coat. His statue stood in front of the KGB headquarters on Moscow's Dzerzhinsky Square until it was toppled in August 1991 in the wake of the failed last-ditch attempt by die-hard conservative communists to seize power by coup d'etat and stop Gorbachev's democratic reforms. An ethnic Pole from an aristocratic family in Imperial Russia, he turned revolutionary against the Tsar, spent most of his life in prison in Imperial Russian secret police cells until he suddenly found himself appointed the head of a new Bolshevik secret police, the Cheka, the sword and shield of the revolution. Dzerzhinsky was an incorruptible killer, and relentless in his pursuit of counter-revolutionaries and potential counter-revolutionaries, almost pathologically obsessive with cleansing what he called the dirt and filth that obstructed the dictatorship of the proletariat. And indeed, the term used, purge or čistka, meant literally cleaning, or the way we might use purge in a kind of a medical sense. Dzerzhinsky certainly had a poetic turn of phrase when articulating the ideology of his boss, Vladimir Lenin. The fact you are free is not your achievement, but rather a failure on our side. He rarely went home. Instead, slept in his office and would eventually die of a heart attack at work. And he leaves behind one of the most chilling phrases in the annals of totalitarian dictatorships. The people are everything, persons are nothing. Lenin's successor, Stalin, would amp up the game. Nikolai Yezhov, the poison dwarf, Stalin's diminutive chief of secret police, which by now had been renamed the GPU and the NKVD. Yezhov, too, was relentless in his search for counter-revolutionaries. He was portrayed in Soviet media as the iron glove of the revolution, crushing counter-revolutionaries. And in a period known as the Great Terror, 18 months in 1937 and 38, he arrested an extraordinary 1.5 million people at a rate of about 4,000 people a day, and summarily executed 750,000 of them, half, 750,000. Millions were brutally tortured, forced to confess, and forced to implicate their neighbors, their colleagues, their friends and family, who in turn were tortured to do the same. Those who survived, some ended up decades in the Gulag slave camp system. We call it the Great Terror, but the Russians called it the Yezhovshchina, the time of Yezhov, 1937 to 1938. And in the end, when Yezhov couldn't chop enough wood to satisfy his master, he was one of the chips that flew. Yezhov was arrested and shot and replaced by even more brutal henchman, Lavrenti Beria, who was just as able to articulate his master's philosophy of justice in Stalin's Soviet Union. Show me the man, and I'll find you the crime. In Iran, there was the cruel Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the peacock throne king of Iran. He had come to power in 1941 during World War II, when the British, Americans, and Russians occupied Iran and ousted his pro-Nazi father. After the Allies departed Iran at the end of 1945, he remained a constitutional monarch in a democratic parliamentary monarchy. But when the democratic government of Iran in the early 1950s began a program of nationalizing British oil fields in Iran, the government was overthrown by a joint MI6 and CIA operation in 1953. And now the Shah was installed by the CIA as a despotic pro American oil company king and defended by the US and subsidized by the US State Department. He was corrupt, he was ruthless. The Shah had a feared secret police, the notorious Savak. Today, Savak headquarters and its torture dome are a national museum in Iran. It is here the Shah's opponents were tied to the iron bars and beaten, or had their heads forced into the waters of the courtyard fountain, and were interrogated and sometimes were put to the favorite torture in Iran, the beating of the soles of the feet. Many of these torturers were trained in U.S. military and police academies. The Savak was supplied with American weapons. And gradually, the United States became the symbol of that oppression that Iranians saw at the hands of the Shah. It's why Iran still has this hate for the United States to this day. Islam became a counter-American cultural identity for Iranians in opposition. Both secular and religious opposition coalesced around a fundamentalist Islamic cleric in exile, Ayatollah Khomeini. And in 1979, the Shah was forced to abdicate and go into exile, and the Pahlavi's imperial regime finally came to an end. And then, typically, things just got worse. As Che Guevara once said, cruel leaders are replaced only to have new leaders turn cruel. He might have been referring to his master in Cuba, Fidel Castro. What Khomeini's Islamic revolution would perpetrate and continues to perpetrate in now the Islamic dictatorship in Iran to this day, far overshadowed in cruelty and savagery the crimes of the Shah. Dictators sometimes emerge from the most unexpected places, unannounced, like sleepers. Dr. Francois Duvalier, Papa Doc, a mild-mannered Haitian physician, rose to the rank of Minister of Health in the 1950s and was eventually democratically elected conventionally as a president in 1957. But gradually, he became more isolated, more paranoid, and repressive. He began killing first his opponents with death squads, and then those he suspected of being his opponents, and then those he thought might one day become his opponents. Eventually, Papa Doc crossed over to the crazy occult dark side. He began practicing voodoo rituals and building his own private paramilitary of killers, the notorious volunteers of national security, the Tonton Makut, which means Uncle Gunny Sack. They were his Pretoria's his Praetorian death squads, named for a bogeyman figure in Haitian lore, Uncle Gunnysack, who comes at night to take bad children away in a gunny sack. Often high on hallucinogenic brews, the Tonton Makut were savage and wore these outlandish voodoo-like regalia, and they would come in the night, abducting and savagely torturing and murdering tens and thousands of Haitians. Even the Haitian army itself feared the Tonton Makut. Their predilection for Ray-Ban sunglasses was dramatically illustrated in the 1967 movie based on the Graham Greene novel, The Comedians. I remember accompanying my parents to see this movie when I was 11 years old, and despite its cast of Richard Burton, Elizabeth Taylor, Alec Guinness, Peter Ustinov, and a very promising title, there were no jokes or laughs in the comedians. It left quite an impression on my 11-year-old imagination in its portrayal of the sinister Tonton Makut. And of course, Duvalier's legacy in Haiti continues to live on. Of course, it's Baby Doc, his son, who would eventually replace Papa Doc as a dictator, and Tonton Makut continue to function in Haiti today, although again, they're called today the VSN, the Volunteers of National Security, the Volontaires de la Sécurité Nationale. In Cambodia, mid to late 1970s, the mild-mannered Saloth Sar, Pol Pot, the teacher, a Paris University educated revolutionary who eventually came to lead the Khmer Rouge. He used thousands and thousands of children, first to do the fighting for the Khmer Rouge. Afterwards, when the fighting was done, it's the children who were then assigned the job of doing the mass killing of some 1.7 to perhaps as many as 2.5 million Cambodians under the Khmer Rouge regime in the last years of the 1970s.
The Khmer Rouge secret police was called the Santabal, a Khmer term meaning keeper, keepers of the peace. And it was staffed by adolescent former child soldiers who were hardened by years of brutal jungle fighting. They were assigned to kill millions of Cambodians by battering them to death with garden tools or suffocating them with plastic garbage bags. Infants were bayoneted or dashed against tree trunks as this popular genre of contemporary art in Cambodia depicts, some of it by the children themselves. I had an opportunity in the late 80s, early 1990s to actually interview some of these former child executioners who found their way as refugees into Canada and um, was kind of an extraordinary. Well, I guess maybe I'll save that for a future lecture when I don't think I could do the dictators without touching on the Pol Pot regime in more detail and give you a better chronology of it. So we'll go there when we go there. This is not at all an exaggeration, as the Khmer Rouge often not only beheaded their victims, but as well took their liver, as well, as you can see, wrapped up in that bundle as a kind of a war ritual. Not an uncommon thing in warfare. The killing was also formalized and industrialized in these set about killing centers. The most notorious killing center in Cambodia, prison number 21 in Phnom Penh, called Tul Slang. The poison tree was located in a schoolhouse, and the classrooms were converted into prison cells and torture chambers. And today it's preserved as a genocide museum. Here you can see some of the um, rules for prisoners in um, prison S21. I think the one that kind of catches my attention, rule number 6. While getting lashes or electrification, you must not cry at all. Here, some of the more highest priority prisoners, including those killing children, who eventually began to scare their Khmer Rouge masters, and they themselves were brought to Tul Slang as child prisoners, tortured and put to death, very similarly in the Stalin model, where when we look at his career, we'll see he would sometimes purge and kill the most loyal of his followers. Here, they were tortured with electric shocks and beatings and mutilation on these iron mattress beds. And each prisoner was meticulously photographed on their intake, leaving behind this kind of record of a dictator's victims, person by person. Perhaps these images are much more disturbing and haunting than the actual images of some of the atrocities that were perpetrated. The director of Tol Slang was a mild-mannered, smiling mathematician, Kankek Eev, or Comrade Duck, as he was known. He was as educated as Pol Pot was. And it actually won't be until the 2000s that Comrade Duck will be later identified and apprehended. He was free in the 2000s, granting interviews of describing some of the things he had perpetrated in prison S21. He, of course, claimed he was only following orders, that he was dealing with genuine enemies. And in the end, of course, he will be arrested and he will go before an international court of justice, which have been trials, genocide trials that have been taking place in Phnom Penh since the 2000s. And he will be eventually sentenced to life in prison, and he'll die quite recently in September of 2020. What is extraordinary about all these dictators is how many of these dictators were loved by the very people they oppressed. Many of these images are not false propaganda images, but photographs that capture the genuine expression of people's affection, albeit that affection was often conditioned in people from childhood through education and propaganda. This picture of Stalin with an admiring girl was famously taken about the same time that her father had been taken away by the secret police and shot. And historically, in Russia, typically Russians could not believe that their rulers, whether Tsars or Communist Party chairmen, were aware of the cruelties being perpetrated by their apparatus. If only Stalin knew was a common refrain during this period, with Russians sometimes writing letters to Stalin denouncing the mass arrests and executions, begging him to investigate them on the assumption that Stalin had no knowledge what was going on. And, that is not, I think Russians certainly are not the only repressed people that reacted that way or adapted that way. And occasionally Stalin would discover, in quotation marks, that his previous two secret police chiefs, Yagoda and Yezhov, were perpetrating unconstitutional extrajudicial killings, and he arrested them and executed them, giving the people what they want, while quietly replacing them with a new killer with instructions to kill twice as many as as the killer's predecessor, or else chips will fly. That too is a common technique of dictators, to blame their own brutality on minions acting without their knowledge. It's in some ways the Russian style to this day. Many Russians slavishly love and admire Putin. It's not fake, despite the current protests underway in Russia. It will be interesting to see how Putin will deal with this sudden rise in popular protest we have been recently witnessing. It's the Russians, Khrushchev, that will come up with the term for this strange, almost masochistic love of an oppressed people for their dictatorial oppressor. The cult of personality. Personality, charisma, myth prevails over the facts. And Khrushchev, when in 1956 at the 20th Communist Party Congress, he denounces the crimes of Stalin, will characterize that process as the cult of personality. And Russia is not the only place where the cult functions. North Korea, that had been sponsored by Stalin in 1945, is one of the most avid practitioners of the cult of personality, often raising their leaders almost to a demigod status. This love and adoration of an oppressed people, while it might not be an organic love, it is artificially created, but nonetheless, it is a genuinely felt love. The freedom of speech and political freedom is something that is not highly treasured by most, despite the kind of lip service we give it here in the West. What concerns most people I found traveling through repressive regimes is personal safety for themselves and their families and having food in their fridge. The ability to express themselves freely is really for a political, intellectual minority elite. As long as people can eat and not be killed, they mostly will happily remain silent. And I often ask my students at Ryerson to raise their hand the last time they exercised their freedom of speech. Very few raise their hand, and I'm sure that very few of you would as well. We mostly do not exercise that freedom. It's something that is more valuable to those of us who are more active, or as I say, who are in that kind of intellectual elite who espouse opinions on governance, on current issues. Most of us, we just don't care as long as our check comes on time, and as I say, the fridge is full and no one is killing us, which more or less is the situation that we live in Western societies. And so historically, the absence of the freedom of speech is not often that missed in the broad base of the population, especially in those populations that have a history of dictatorial regimes, as many Asian societies do, Eastern
European societies and third world societies, whether it was from European colonial oppression or whether it was from indigenous oppression. Nonetheless, that's how it is. As long as the people are fed and feel safe, they will love their dictator. And aside from the oppositionist factions in Iraq, for example, the broad base of the Iraqi population loved Saddam Hussein. They were proud of him, they were loyal to him. These, again, are not doctored or staged propaganda images. These are genuine emotions. Muammar Gaddafi was loved not only by many Libyans, but most recently by Africans in general. When Gaddafi was the head of the Union of African States, he had attempted to extract reparation settlements from former European colonial powers, or else um, threatened that, or else they will face unbridled illegal immigration from the African states. As Gaddafi said, do you want to send the reparations here to the people of Africa, or shall the people of Africa come to Europe and make their claim? That, I suspect, more than anything, led to NATO chasing him into a sewer pipe to his death. Sometimes it's just a matter of point of view. One man's dictator is another man's liberator. To us, Syria's Bashar al-Assad symbolizes a brutal tyrant murdering his own rebellious people. But to a large group of Syrians, the secular socialist Ba'athist al-Assad is the last defense against the repressive forces of fundamental Islam that has swept North Africa and the Middle East in the last 2 decades. And of course, when we come to the love of the most notorious dictator of all, that love was deep and remarkably enduring. No dictator was loved and remains to be still loved by so many as was Hitler. He was loved by the masses. He was loved by women who would swoon around him. He was loved by the young, by adolescents, by children, and by the old. 3 women committed suicide for their love of Hitler. He was loved not only as a political figure, but as well as an intimate. And so when dictators die, they often leave deeply felt, a mixture, I think, of deeply felt grief and insecurity in their wake. Again, the grief is no more organic than the love was. It stems from conditioning, but it is nonetheless felt as real as it can be felt. The funerals of the North Korean dictators were perceived in North Korea as tragic deaths of gods almost, and people genuinely wept.
When Stalin died, there was a solemn state procession for him, and his death was again marked by general grief and sense of loss, but I imagine as well relief, for certainly no one in Stalin's Russia knew whether they would be next. I think it's Winston Churchill who once remarked, when Stalin smiles, I don't know if he's smiling or whether I'm looking into the mouth of a crocodile. Um, but nonetheless, uh, all these people came to this state funeral of the Wojt, as he was known, the boss, as I say, I think the second worst dictator on our list. Hundreds of thousands of people appeared in Moscow to pay their last respects. And again, typical in kind of Russian mass events of this kind, some were trampled to death in the crush of crowds to view um, the coffin. And so many dictators went to their deaths in the same way they went through their lives, loved by their victims, at least by the victims under whose jurisdiction um, they were. Um, Loved by many, but not by all. For example, in New York's Ukrainian neighborhood on the Lower East Side, Stalin's death was celebrated with offerings of free borscht in Ukrainian restaurants. Not all dictators will get that solemn state funeral. Mussolini and his mistress Clara were, during their escape at the end of the war, overtaken by Italian partisans and summarily shot, and then their bodies were driven into Milan and hung up by the heels at a gas station where crowds of Italians spit at them and threw stones and fruit at the bodies. And yet, even today, there are still many Italians who love and admire Mussolini for the order that he had imposed on society. Some who had not even been born when he had died. Saddam Hussein, likewise, did not get that kind of state funeral for a dictator with mourners. Hussein was chased into a hole in the ground, eventually captured by U.S. Special Forces, dragged out of his hole and put on trial, and then hung. Gaddafi was dragged out by NATO-backed Libyan rebels from a sewer pipe in which he was cowering and brutally beaten and stabbed to death by crowds. And who can forget, from our generation, the dramatic fall of Romanian dictator Nicolae Ceausescu and his evil wife, Elena, in December of 1989, which I think many of us watched live on television on Christmas Day that year. These two ruled Romania with absolute power for decades. They were the Warsaw Pact power couple and party animals who squandered the nation's wealth on partying, on hair salons and clothing, drink and fur and luxury travel. They were feted and hosted by heads of state to the point that Elena and Nicolae Ceausescu's were themselves the symbol of Romania. They became almost fossilized as dictators with no sense of reality. Almost they were so sheltered and isolated as dictators. They became these mythical symbols, sometimes even portrayed as iconic saints. And when they spent the treasury, just blew it out, bankrupted the state. In the 1980s, they now introduced necessary austerity measures that left millions of Romanians living in abject poverty. Who can forget those images of Romanian orphans in cages with bed sores and protruding ribs from malnutrition that were revealed in the ending months of the Romanian regime and the fall of communism in Romania? In the end, they lost touch completely. When the rest of the communist Eastern European zone, the Warsaw Pact, began taking their cues from the democratic elections that Gorbachev introduced in the Soviet Union in the winter of 1989, and the Berlin Wall came down in Germany, nothing had changed in Romania. The end came very sudden and unexpectedly for the Ceausescus. In December, a carefully selected crowd was assembled for a televised speech by Ceausescu and his wife, but to everybody's shock, even this selected crowd began to boo, whistle, and hiss. Ceausescu, to his shock, responded in the only way a dictator knows how to: brute force. The Securitat, the Romanian secret police and its armed services, began to put down violently demonstrations in Romania that December of 1989. But this time, even the oppressors' instruments turned against them and took the crowd's side. The fall of the Ceausescu dictatorship was quick and brutal. They were evacuated by a helicopter from the palace in which they were under siege, but the pilots, after landing, abandoned them. They attempted hitchhiking to safety, but no one would give them a ride. Eventually, they sought shelter in a school where the school caretaker locked them into a classroom and called the rebels. And so the Ceausescus were now summarily put on trial for the mass murder of some 75,000 fellow Romanians. The former Warsaw Pact power couple haughtily dismissed the authority of the court, claiming they had presidential immunity, and warning the court that when the farce was going to come to an end, the judges would be facing them in the dock. And of course, they were completely out of touch with reality. It's almost sad in a way. It's as if the couple was suffering from Alzheimer's, totally unaware of what happened in Romania or what was happening to them. As soon as the sentence was pronounced, to their shock, they were told that they're going to be immediately executed. They were cuffed and dragged, fighting and clawing out of the classroom into the schoolyard, where they will be summarily shot. Not an unusual end to dictators. Some get state funerals. Others, as they say, those who live by the sword die by the sword. Others were sometimes the last victims in their own history of a long line of victims under their regime. And so the Ceausescus are executed by firing squad, as I say, within minutes of their sentence being pronounced. The site of their execution typically became not only a tourist attraction, but as well a site for pro-Ceausescu admirers, as is their grave, which is tenderly tended to by thousands of their admirers and fans, despite the crimes that they had perpetrated against their own people. And that still is something remarkable about this kind of persisting love for dictators, sometimes by people who never actually lived during the time of the dictatorship. I'm thinking, of course, of neo-Nazis who still see Hitler as a god. So, with these general observation on the nature of dictators, love and hate, their rule, and sometimes downfall. In the next lecture, I will turn to explore in more detail the lives and regimes of some of recent history's most notorious dictators, starting off with the obvious, the big one, Adolf Hitler.